The prophet Micah walked out to the edge of the city, came to the city's edge and climbed up on the top of the wall surrounding the holy city, and looked out at the beginning of Micah chapter 5. And what he saw wasn't good. Things looked bad. In every direction he looked, according to Micah 5 verse 1, he could see what looked like a secondary wall. The enemy army was so close in about the city, their camp encircled and seemed to form a new perimeter around the holy city. Jerusalem lay under siege. And things reached their absolute worst when the ruler of the city was captured and not spared embarrassment, not placed in some private encampment, but every so often pulled out in the front of the camp, where God's children could look out from the city and see him pulled there in front of the enemy army, where they would beat him about the face so that his people could see it. Every direction, everywhere Micah looked, things were bad. And yet he was so bold that with confidence he would write in verse 2, "All is not lost." All is not lost, he would say. He would speak to a little town that had a double name. It was a little town so inconsequential, so forgotten, that people would argue over what to call it. Is it the new name of Bethlehem, or is it the old name of Ephrathah? It's a little bit like what things must have been like as our little church was being founded here 200 some odd years ago. There were probably some folks who still called this place Lebanon, because that's what Elijah Craig called it when he founded the town. Yet others wanted to acknowledge our nation's first president, and so they called it Georgetown. Micah spoke to this little town, forgotten, double-named Bethlehem Ephrathah, and said, "God's new ruler will come from you." A place that is forgotten, a place that means nothing. And in keeping with that line of thought, this new ruler will not come from where you might expect. He will not come from power. He will not come marching in over the yonder hill. He will come as a shepherd in verse 4. For generations, one of the most vexing questions, one of the most controversial topics in the New Testament is this question of why in the world the angel choir would appear to the shepherds. Why waste your time out of town with a bunch of nobodies, people out there tending their flocks by night, people doing God knows what, trespassing all over everybody else's property? Why would you appear to the shepherds? And now we know. Micah tells us the promised one will be a shepherd. The promised one identifies with the shepherds. The promised one is a shepherd. And so is it any wonder that the Scripture tells us that Jesus would look out upon His people and have compassion of them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He quotes a passage that is often repeated in the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 27, 1 Kings 22, Ezekiel 34. They are like sheep without a shepherd. Now, I went to seminary with a fella from West Virginia, and he had a plain way of speaking. And so every time in a classroom setting where someone would mention a shepherd, or especially when someone would mention sheep, you could hear my buddy Hutch in the back of the room, and he would sort of mumble under his breath two words. Every time the word sheep came up, he would utter the words, "dumb animals." Dumb animals, Hutch would say. And he would utter that same phrase whenever people started talking about the idea of Jesus seeing us as sheep. You would hear Hutch say, dumb animals. And I always sort of bristled against that. I don't like being referred to as a dumb animal. I resist that assessment because I resemble that assessment. But on the other hand, yesterday they laid to rest that final precious life taken at Newtown. The last funeral from Sandy Hook. That tragedy, that horror has been examined from so many different perspectives. We've heard the conversation about mental health. We've heard it as a political conversation. We've heard it expressed from the various gun lobbies. We've heard it discussed as a school safety strategy issue. But all these many days later, as the family of God gathers for worship, I finally have realized what it is that's been eating at me. In addition to all of these other layers, levels, topics at Sandy Hook in Newtown, there is also a theological matter here. There's also a theological question. It could be approached from a variety of different ways. It could be approached from the problem of evil. It could be approached from the problem of the power of God. But the very basic way that Christians through history have understood tragedies such as this is the same. Isaiah 55 said, we all like sheep have gone astray. 1 Peter chapter 2, you were going astray like sheep, but now after the cross you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your soul. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in all of Scripture. Psalm 119 follows the pattern of an acrostic all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. And the final verse, at the very end of Psalm 119, the psalmist closes with these words, I have gone away like a lost sheep. So seek out your servant, for I do not forget your commandments. At some level, what has happened at Sandy Hook and what happens in each of our lives is a sin problem. At some level is an immoral act for which the perpetrator will be held accountable, responsible. This is what sin does to our world. It takes innocence and trashes it. And that's where God's shepherd comes in, according to Micah. And God's shepherd, Micah says, God's children can dwell secure, or they can live in security. That's a phrase that is used again and again in the Old Testament. It's used first when God is describing in the book of Leviticus God's plan for every 50 years, a cycle. And in the 50th year, God's children will declare a jubilee. In that jubilee year, they will return all property to its original owner, and they will refuse to charge interest, and they will abide by the statutes of festivals and so on. And by doing these things, they will dwell secure in the land. In those first few introductory verses to that ancient treasure trove of wisdom that we call the book of Proverbs, the author writes, those who listen to me will dwell secure. Same language. Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Old Testament prophets, love to repeat this phrase when they talk about what it's going to be like when God restores Israel. There will be no more worries. After God's children are carried off into captivity, after they endure the hardship there and they return, at that time, Jeremiah and Ezekiel say again and again, God's children will dwell secure. In God's shepherd, we can dwell secure because, Micah says, we will find peace in Him. He is our peace in verse 5. If you notice, this passage, Micah chapter 5, begins in violence. It begins with a marauding, invading army laying siege to the holy city, and it continues on at verse 6 with violence. But here in the middle, in verse 5, is the promise that despite all of the violence, despite all of the sorrow, all of the grief, God's children can dwell secure in the peace of God's shepherd. Now, all those other things are good. Having a name, having renown, having success, establishing wealth, gaining the upper hand, all of those things are fine. But what I really need, Micah says, is a shepherd. Now, what do we know about shepherds? We know, for starters, that a shepherd will do anything to protect his sheep. A shepherd will even protect the sheep from themselves. Because the shepherd knows them. The shepherd doesn't need name tags. The shepherd doesn't need a list. The shepherd knows. The shepherd was there when the sheep were born, aided in the birthing process, raised them up, has cared for them all their lives. The shepherd knows their uniqueness. The shepherd knows their tendencies, their broken places, their giftedness. Verse 3 makes a haunting statement. The shepherd will even leave the sheep to themselves if that's what we choose. Now, I want to be clear, because so many people have grieved over this passage, misunderstanding it to say that God occasionally takes a vacation on God's children, or quits on God's children, gives up, walks away, abandons them. And that's not what this passage is saying. This passage is saying that if God's children choose a life without God, if the sheep choose a life without the shepherd will honor that choice. Understand, He's giving them what they've asked for, even though He has advised against it, has taught against it again and again. It's someone like that moment in 1 Samuel. God has raised up a deliverer, Moses, who has led God's children out of Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land. God has raised up generation after generation of judges, people to lead politically, militarily over God's people. And the greatest judge of them all, Samuel, has done so beautifully. But Samuel reaches late in life and begins to start the transition process to his children, and the people don't like it. They come to Samuel and say, "Your children are crooks. We don't want them judging over us. We want a king." And Samuel says, "You think you want a king, but you don't want a king." "Yes, we want a king." "No, you don't really want a king. You're just upset." "Yes, we want a king." And finally God says, "This isn't about you, Samuel. This is about me. They've forsaken me as their God, and I will allow them to do so. Give them a king. But I won't turn my back on them." So when Micah speaks of God giving up the sheep, what he's really saying is that God will honor our decisions. God will not impose God's will upon us. God will not force God's self upon God's children. Jesus is the one who gave the story of the good shepherd leaving behind the 99 sheep in safety and going out in pursuit of the one that has gone astray, has lost its way, and reclaiming it and bringing it home. A shepherd will do anything to protect his sheep, even protecting the sheep from themselves. But a shepherd will also protect against external threats. Verse 4, Micah says, "The shepherd will feed the sheep in strength." Anyone who's there to do them harm will not recognize the feeding as a time to attack because the shepherd is distracted. Anyone wanting to attack will recognize the shepherd is strong. The shepherd feeds them in strength, and so I will not attack even at this moment of distraction. This happens because the shepherd plans ahead, moves the flock away from dangerous areas, guides the flock towards safety. David was the one who said before he became king, when he was shepherding his father's flocks, every once in a while he would have to fight a wild animal and kill it to protect the flock. Jesus is the one who said, the good shepherd will guide the sheep into a safe enclosure, and that will lay his own body across the opening to that enclosure, so that anyone wanting to do them harm would have to cross the shepherd's body, and any sheep trying to leave would have to do the same. The shepherd will protect the sheep from external threats as well. Now, there's just one problem with all of this rich imagery of shepherding. Just one problem. These are ancient references. We live in the 21st century. Anybody here shepherded a flock lately? Not too many of us. It's difficult for us to understand these ancient references. Instead, I'm reminded of that Christmas story that perhaps you've run across at some point. Perhaps you've even read the short story, The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. Some of you remember that story. It's the story of a young couple, Della, Jim. They live together in a low-rent flat, which taxes their ability to pay. They can barely make ends meet. And as they look around their household getting ready for Christmas, they find that there's not much left over at the end of the year. It's time to purchase any Christmas gifts that are going to be exchanged, and they see very little money that they've saved. In fact, in their entire household, there are only two things really of value. The first is Della's beautiful hair. She's grown out her hair all her life. It hangs down well below her waist. Everyone comments on it when they pass. It's beautiful. The other prized possession, a pocket watch that's been passed down in Jim's family from generation to generation. So Christmas Eve comes, and you can see what happens. Della sells her hair, has it cut, to buy Jim a chain for his pocket watch. Jim, in turn, sells his pocket watch to buy Della decorative combs for her hair. And they arrive home Christmas Eve and discover what they've done. No hair, no pocket watch anymore. And that's the end of the story. Now the narrator ruminates, adds a few lines at the end of the story, says this, "Here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of two foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days," he writes, "let it be said that of all who give gifts, these two were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi." Did you catch that phrase, tongue in cheek? Sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. Now, I was surprised when this story was assigned for me to read somewhere along the way, and I read the story and that was the end. Because this isn't the version that I grew up with. I grew up with a different version, starring two different characters in the roles of Della and Jim. In the story that I knew, the characters were called Bert and Ernie. I had a copy of this recording on vinyl, and I played it until I wore out my record player as a kiddo. And Christmas Eve on Sesame Street tells the story differently. Christmas Eve, Ernie sells his rubber ducky to buy a cigar box for Bert's paperclip collection. And Bert sells his paperclip collection to buy a soap dish for Ernie's rubber ducky. So imagine my surprise when I read O. Henry's original, and she left the audience unsatisfied. In the Sesame Street version, comes a knock at the door. And it's Mr. Hooper, the kindly shopkeeper, with whom each of the roommates had done business to get ready for Christmas Eve. And Mr. Hooper unexpectedly has presents for them. Mr. Hooper has a rubber ducky and the paperclip collection. Bert and Ernie protest. Mr. Hooper, we don't have any presents for you. And he says to them, you're wrong, boys. You gave me the best present ever. He wishes them a Merry Christmas and exits. See, the Good Shepherd is like that. Not a cosmic housekeeper, someone who comes along behind us and tidies up our little messes. Not a magician, not someone who fixes all of our pettiness. The shepherd is like that because the shepherd knows that shepherding is mostly about love. Mostly about knowing the flock. Knowing what the flock treasures the most. And most would sacrifice. Or would most need to sacrifice. The shepherd is watching out for the flock. Think of the work that is described in the 23rd Psalm. The work of the shepherd. He cares for my daily needs, giving me a place to lie down and enough to eat. He leads me. He restores me. He accompanies me through those most shadowed places of death and struggle and sacrifice. He reassures me when I would feel fearful. He stands up for me when my enemies surround me. He makes me feel special and assures me that we will be together for all time. That's the work of the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd guides our sacrifice because the Good Shepherd gave the original sacrifice. The last 4 Sundays have led up to this time. Tomorrow afternoon and evening at 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock, we'll gather back in this place. We'll sing, we'll lower the lights, we'll burn candles, and we will proclaim boldly that the promised one of God has come. We will state that the righteous branch of Jeremiah, the refiner whom the messenger foretold in Malachi, the victorious king of Zephaniah and Micah's good shepherd, have come. Not in a palace or in a warrior's mansion, but in a manger, forgotten, misplaced. He is born. He is born. And He is our peace. All these generations, all these centuries later, He is our peace. We may dwell secure in the land. Don't wait. Don't wait. Don't miss that true celebration in your heart. If you've not said yes, if you've not invited Him in, if you've not proclaimed that He is born, let Him be your peace, and you will dwell secure. No matter what comes, no matter where the road may lead, you will be at peace. You will dwell secure in this life and in the next. If you're ready to give your life to Him, if you're ready to come home, our musicians are going to lead us into a time of response. If you're ready to say, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, I declare it now and forevermore, we just ask that you step forward from where you are and share that decision with us, with one of the pastors. Or if you're making another decision, that it's time to come home to the family of God in the life of this church, be a member of Georgetown Baptist. Or if you're recognizing that God is calling you to make another decision, we would love to pray with you and grow with you in the days ahead. He is our peace. We can dwell secure. May we stand and celebrate the goodness of our God.